1915, never again! 1915, never again! We remember! We remember!
That big red mass is the big red mass of working people in New York City who have a very proud history of struggle.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 30 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. Before we start any video, I want to show you some still pictures of Mumia Abu Jamal. You see in this comparison that his physical condition has obviously gone downhill quickly. But prison doctors didn't look into it until he collapsed in diabetic shock a couple weeks ago. He has been given some care, but clearly not what he needed. Look at his neck in this picture. His supporters say large parts of his body are like this. They are asking you to call the governor and prison officials and urge them to allow Mumia to be seen by a cancer specialist. Now, I know it's a bit scary to call these officials, the governor and prison officials, but actually it isn't. I did it just a few days ago. When you reach the governor, you just get an answering machine. Now, the other two, you do get a live person, secretaries. All they do is take your statement and say they will pass it on. It is not threatening to do this in the least. For more about this, go to the website freemumia.com. Now to New York City on April 26th for two different events. The first, a march from an Armenian cathedral to Times Square to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the genocide of 1.5 million Armenians at the hands of the troops of the Ottoman Sultan, and the continuing denial by the current Turkish government of what really went on. Onan, why did you come down today for this march?
I'm a proud Armenian American, and I feel it my duty to be here to demonstrate, to commemorate 100 years of the genocide. I have both sides of my family, both Armenian, were impacted by the genocide committed by the Turkish government, the Ottoman Turks, in 1915 through 1923.
Have the stories, personal stories, come down to you?
I think every Armenian has a personal story that every family, every Armenian American, every Armenian family across the world has been impacted by the genocide, whether directly, indirectly, especially family members, going back to grandparents and great-grandparents.
Now you have a sign about Turkey and the denial that is going on in some quarters about this. What do you feel about that?
I think it's sad. As a country, Turkey is trying to identify themselves, but from a historical perspective, you cannot go forward until you recognize your past. However dark it is, however shameful it is, however brutal it was. I think every country in the world has had some level of atrocity and war crimes and whatnot, but Turkey should be an example of, if you hide it, you forget it, you try to deny it, it continues to happen. It continues to promote hatred across the world. It gives power to other governments, defunct governments, to go ahead and try to do the same crimes as was committed 100 years ago. You saw it with the Nazis, with Hitler against the German Jews. The Jews in the European countries. You see it today across Middle East with ISIS. You see it in South Africa. You see it in the African countries, Sudan, Darfur. You saw it in Serbia. You saw it in Europe. So it just continues a systemic hatred that one country puts on its minority people.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Also on the 26th, Peace and Planet, a rally and a march to the United Nations to demand an end to nuclear weapons. One of the speakers was Daniel Ellsberg, who in the 1970s released the government study The Pentagon Papers, which showed the extent of government lying about the Vietnam War. In his talk, Ellsberg brought up Ukraine, where nuclear-armed Russia and the United States are going toe-to-toe for the first time since 1962.
Thank you very much. How many people here, I'm glad to see that not everyone is my age here. How many people are under 70? Can I see hands? Okay. You're looking at people who have lived every day of their lives under the shadow of Hiroshima and the shadow of nuclear war, a shadow that has recently been seen as so thin that most of your colleagues who are not here today are not even aware of it. And yet, if the plans today on Russia and the U.S., which are essentially the same in their targeting, their effect on cities, as the plans I worked in the Pentagon half a century ago, if those were triggered by a false alarm, as could happen, or an accident, as could happen any hour of this time, or if they were triggered by escalation of the kind of conflict that we are being groomed for and primed for in the Ukraine, the first direct armed conflict that's threatening now between U.S. and Russians since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. If those plans were carried out, the shadow from the smoke of the burning cities in Russia and China and U.S. and Europe and everywhere else, that smoke would be lofted into the atmosphere, into the upper atmosphere, the stratosphere, by the kind of firestorm that destroyed Hiroshima and another city 5 months earlier, into the stratosphere, where it would go globally around the world and create a shadow that would blot out the sun for over a decade. What's been called nuclear winter, but the effect on that on harvests around the world, killing them, ending vegetation essentially in harvest for a decade, would lead to nuclear famine, to starvation of essentially everyone, northern and southern hemisphere. It is outrageous that these numbers of weapons and their targeting remain on alert or exist in the world. Now, I want to address the people who are over 70 here. It's very moving for an American to be looking at Hibakusha here, and I thank you for the witness of the last 70 years, and that you're still at it very much. Some of the Japanese here might even have been survivors of an even greater terrorist attack which took place 5 months earlier, and which not only prepared the way for Hiroshima, but made the use of the atom bombs virtually inevitable. And that was the firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th and 10th, 1945, of which very few Americans are aware, which killed 80 to 120,000 people, and was followed by the firebombing of another 64 Japanese cities, meant that the nuclear weapons were simply the instrumentation with the one bomb of what we were already using with 300 bombs. The people I'm looking at here right now have been using the last 70 years to try to warn people against that prospect of nuclear annihilation. And we owe them our great thanks and gratitude. And there are other here, even Americans, who have spent more time than I have, which is 40 years. There are people like Peter and Cora Weiss who've been at it longer, doing the same job. What the Buddha would call right livelihood. Using your life, not that excludes right livelihood, arms makers, poison makers, and Gandhi's addition to that dictum was use your life to resist and expose and resist with your own bodies, with your lives, such prospect of annihilation. That's what we're doing. I want to say, from the depth of my height, or whatever, 84 years now, I want to make the judgment, as I say, you have been using your lives well. We have not done too much or too little. We've done everything we can, and we will continue to do it for the rest of our lives, and that is the best use of the life we've been given. Thank you.
As noted by event organizer Leslie Kagan, they weren't able to get a single New York politician to greet the thousands present. Evidently, the politicians are quite comfortable with the Obama plan to modernize American nuclear weapons at the cost of $1 trillion.
Next, we'd like to welcome Reverend Osagyefo Sekou. Sekou was raised in St. Louis.
beginning his ministry at Friendly Temple Missionary Baptist Church. Reverend Sekou was a scholar in residence at Stanford University's Martin Luther King Education and Research Institute. In 2014, before going to Ferguson in mid-August to organize alongside local and national groups, training hundreds in nonviolent civil disobedience. He was arrested twice in Ferguson, once for praying in front of riot police, and later while co-leading a group of religious leaders on Mural Monday. Let's welcome Reverend Sekou.
We have come here this evening to bear witness to an essential truth. And that essential truth is that we have already won. That because we have committed ourselves to the end of nuclear weapons on our planet, and that we are making the connections and solidarity to the broader anti-war movement and to the broader movement that Black life matters. And so we say to the enemies of our struggle that you are on the wrong side of history, that what you see gathered here now, history shall record that there stood a group of people from around the world who committed themselves to a story older than themselves and bigger than themselves, and that is the story of humans struggling to make the world better than the way that they found it. That story is a story about Black youth in a little place called Ferguson who say they will not bow down. It is that story of young people in the streets of Baltimore right now being chased by the police and saying that they will not go home until there's justice for Michael Brown and Eric Gardner and for the victims of the bombing in Japan. That we have already won, and the question before us is that do we believe that we've already won? When we leave this place, are we willing to organize? Are we willing to sacrifice? Are we willing to engage in the kind of work necessary to break the back of the American empire? Are we willing to do that work? And to the members of the NYPD, we say to you, you are on the wrong side of history, that you have a moral and ethical obligation to protect and defend Black and brown children wherever they are. And we say to those who support nuclear weapons, you're on the wrong side of history. We have already won. We have already won. We have already won.
One criticism that could be made of the speeches was that they all tended to be appeals to the authorities to get rid of the hell bombs. I don't think one person condemned by name any of the people driving the mad nuclear policy, nor did they talk about plans to force the authorities to get rid of nuclear weapons. The march was led by Hibakashua, survivors of the U.S. atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, many in wheelchairs. It seemed that most of the marchers in the parade were Asians. Look at all the color in their banners. They put most Peace March banners to shame. Speeches and the full 7,000 person march to the UN on our website and YouTube channel. Now we feature an interview I did with muralist Mike Alewitz about one of his murals that was too uncomfortable for the 1%, and so it couldn't be exhibited in a major New York museum. At Central Connecticut State University, I'll be speaking to Professor Mike Alewitz, who's an activist, a unionist, and a world-class muralist. Now, about a mile from here at a New Britain museum, there's important murals by Thomas Hart Benton. And in New York at the Met, they just finished up with a big Benton retrospective about his work in the 30s. But we're going to be talking about a museum a couple blocks up from the Met in New York, the Museum of the City of New York, which is refusing to show a mural that was constructed by Mike Alewitz for that museum. Good afternoon.
Thank you. Hi.
So tell us about some of the murals you've done around the world.
Well, I'm an agitprop muralist. I paint murals as part of social struggles. So I've worked in Nicaragua, Northern Ireland, in the occupied territories, Chernobyl, and in places in this country like South Central LA and Chicago. And I've worked all over the place. And I do murals with strikes and struggles of working people. And the mural that I was commissioned to paint for the Puffin Gallery in the city, the Museum of the City of New York, was a broad vision of the history of social struggle in New York.
Well, let's get into the details then. When did the idea come to the Puffin Gallery or you to do this thing?
Well, the Puffin Gallery a few years ago endowed the museum. I think they ended up spending over $3 million to construct a gallery about social activism within the museum itself. And Perry Rosenstein, the president of the Puffin Foundation, approached me and asked me to do a mural that would be the centerpiece of the new gallery, which is mostly exhibits, changing exhibits, and permanent exhibits with, viewing stations and videos and things like that. And I set about doing the work, and I presented a proposal to a blue ribbon committee that they had formed to oversee the construction of the gallery. And it was unanimously endorsed. It was very enthusiastically endorsed. However, when I completed the mural a couple of years...
Let me go back.
Yeah.
So how detailed in your proposal, how detailed is the picture? Did they
Oh,
really
no,
have
it
an
was-
idea?
Yeah, it was absolutely clear what it was. Yeah, there was no... It was a very well-developed proposal. This was not a case of Diego Rivera slipping in Lenin for Rockefeller. There were no surprises here. They knew what it was going to be when they approved it. However, the museum director, Susan Henshaw Jones, who has deep ties to the financial powers of the city, overturned the decision and just said no. And unfortunately, the committee and the Puffin Foundation acquiesced to that and, basically just didn't want to make waves and went along with it.
Yeah.
And I might add, pretty much everybody has gone along with it, because since it's the Puffin Foundation, which funds left-wing and progressive causes, a lot of the people who would normally oppose this kind of censorship have been completely silent about it.
Well, what specifically didn't she, if she's the person, what didn't she like about them?
Well, it's not completely clear. There are some things. I got some missives from the Puffin Foundation. Puffin originally accepted it and wanted it to go in, and they tried to get the museum to install it. They would send me notes, and they objected to a number of things. Basically, what it revolved around was two central things. They objected to the fact that I had created a triptych based loosely on Hieronymus Bosch's great and epic painting, The Garden of Earthly Delights. In my case, it showed the past of labor, the hell of exploitation it was called, a broad sweep of social struggle as the centerpiece of the triptych, and then a triptych that showed the future. And what they wanted me to do was to make one piece out of these. Now, that might seem like just an arbitrary mechanical or graphic thing, but in reality, what they objected to was the idea that I was portraying that there was a kind of march of history to labor, that we had come from a certain place and that we could envision a future place. And the reason that they don't like that is because they have a different view of working people and how they want to portray working people. As an enlightened institution that really represents the 1%, they don't mind having workers in their galleries and showing images of workers in their galleries as long as they're kind of neutered workers, as long as they're declawed, as long as they're not really fighting for a future. You know, they think it's okay for people to come into a gallery and feel bad about child laborers. But they don't feel as comfortable with images that portray the fight against child labor today.
But I thought you said they saw this at the very beginning.
Well, the committee saw it. Susan Henshaw Jones did not see it, and or did not at that point make an issue about it. And the other thing was just they began to fish around for things, which included things like wanting to put in, create a more balanced view. They wanted to put in nativists, for example. They said, well, this is part of activism in New York. And the nativists, for those people who might not know, were, anti-immigrant, often anti-Semitic, often racist, and were right-wing activists. And I don't put those people in a favorable light in my murals. I'm certainly not going to include people like that, along with the likes of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King and all those kind of people, who they objected to also. They objected to the Kings being the centerpiece of the mural.
I mean, they got down to that silly level of saying they were too...
Yeah, they were looking for things. They were trying to find things. They said, well, they're not iconic for New York, which is obviously stupid because Dr. King gave some of his most important speeches at Riverside Church in New York City, but it doesn't matter. I mean, they were just looking for reasons. They just didn't want it because it clearly pointed out the 1%, what they were responsible for, and this broad sweep of history that is part of our working class heritage. And it was a call to continue that struggle, and that is what they don't want.
Now, you didn't just take it line. Well, did they pay you?
Well, it was a very modest amount. I've learned a long time ago that you don't do a lot of work without getting some commitment. Mm-hmm. So I got a financial commitment from them, but that's not why I was doing it. The real pay was to have this piece hanging in the Museum of the City of New York. And so basically they cheated me out of that. And they cheated the working people of New York, which is much more important. I'm not going to go hungry. I'm a college professor. And what they did is criminal. It's a disservice to the working people of New York, and really far worse than what happened to Diego Rivera. Because first of all, I'm not Diego Rivera. I don't have an international press waiting to hear what I have to say about things. I don't have that. I'm not a caliber of artist that he was. I'm a working class artist that struggles to get my work up. And second of all, because it's supposed to be an enlightened museum, and Puffin's supposed to be an enlightened foundation. And what we see here revealed is the phony nature of these so-called philanthropic organizations. As long as you're meek, they're happy to fund you. And the minute you stop being meek, the minute you bare your teeth a little bit, not so much.
Now, you are speaking out about this, obviously, by doing this interview, and I understand there's a petition.
There is a petition at change.org. And the murals I designed to be portable pieces, and we've taken them. I took them up to Cornell for Union Days a couple of weeks ago, and we had a very successful event up there. There's people in Philadelphia who are organizing some events. I'm going to bring the murals down to Philadelphia, where we're going to have a panel on why censorship is a labor issue in Philadelphia. If anyone would like to bring the murals, I throw them in my van and off we go. They were designed to be used. They were designed to be used at conferences or conventions or demonstrations or wherever we can use them. That's the kind of art that I do, and if anyone out there would like to get them, you can find me at Easiest thing to do is just go to my Facebook page. It's Alewitz, Alewitz, and send me a note, and we'll set it up.
Now we're going to link to the pictures on our website, but we're also going to sort of superimpose them over here. So if our cameraman could give us a little space there where we'll actually put the picture when we edit this. If we could just talk about it a little bit, we'll talk about it. So the first thing that struck my eye is this mass of red, where there's a lot of people and the word solidarity forever. So what were you trying to get across?
Well, that actually, there's a lot of details in that, but basically what it is it's a broad sweep of labor history in New York. It shows the maritime strikes, it shows the suffrage movement. It begins with the indigenous people and the struggle of the indigenous people. It goes through Stonewall and the anti-Vietnam War movement and the Puerto Rican liberation strike and different labor struggles and the Patterson Silk Strike pageant at Madison Square Garden and a lot more things that I could possibly remember. So there's all that kind of stuff in there. That's the centerpiece, and that big red mass is the big red mass of working people in New York City who have a very proud history of struggle, very proud history of struggle, and it deserves to be on the walls of the museum.
One part, I don't probably remember the words exactly, but it was a slave ship, and it said something about Wall Street. What's the connection, Wall Street and slaves?
Well, one of the first piece, which is called The Hell of Exploitation, is a portrayal of basically where the wealth of this country comes from, which is two main sources. One was the extermination of the indigenous people, which I portray in the first panel of the mural. And the second was the exploitation of chattel slave labor, African slave labor. And Wall Street was actually where the slave ships pulled up to the port in Manhattan. That's what Wall Street originally was. And so I show the slave ship arriving at Wall Street, and all of the fortunes of these great financial institutions, and all of the fortunes of the people who give money to these museums, and all of the fortunes of these big corporations, and all of the great wealth of this country comes from the brutal exploitation of slave labor.
Last thing that visually, there was a building, and it looks like sort of missiles flying down, and then you realize what it is, and that was pretty amazing.
Well, it's the Triangle Fire, and it's young women workers jumping in flames from the Triangle Fire building. That's one of the images that's there. There's images of child labor. There's images of the exploitation of people like Oda Benga, who was a Congolese pygmy who was kept in the Bronx Museum as an exhibit. These museums used to have things like that. We
have just 1 minute, but there's also some hopeful stuff about the future. If we could say one word about that.
Yes, it's very hopeful. And at the entire last panel is two giant fists rising out from the earth with bread and roses. Bread and roses is a symbol of the working class. Bread represents the fight for economic justice. Roses represents the fight for a real, genuine, spiritual life, for beauty in our lives, and for the aspirations of working people to have a better world.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.